Hello there, and welcome to our webinar today, looking at fintech ecosystems in the Asia Pacific region. My name is Simon Hardie, the CEO and co-founder of Findexable, the home of the Global FinTech Index, and I'm joined today, I'm delighted to say, by three very eminent speakers from the region. We have Norbert Gerke over in Tokyo from FinTech Japan, from Japan FinTech. We have Rebecca Schott-Guppy from FinTech Australia, and we also have James Brown over in Auckland at FinTech New Zealand. So I'm going to give us just a brief overview of some of the indicators from the launch index that we published at the end of last year. Just a quick snapshot of what fintech hubs look like across the Asia Pacific region, and then we're going to jump into a discussion. On the right hand side of the screen, you can see that there's an option to ask questions, so by all means keep the questions coming to us. And also there's a vote section. If you click on the votes from audience button, there's a polling question in there, so that's live. Please go ahead and vote whenever you're comfortable and ready, and at some point we'll come back to that and look at the results. So, just a quick word about us. We launched the Global FinTech Index in December last year. The concept is really to kind of build out a large real-time indicator of fintech companies worldwide, and we started with a ranking of fintech cities and countries, which we published in December. We also work with a partner that looks at startup hubs generally, and some of the things we're going to be talking about today is how fintech hubs compare with startup hubs, what some of the differences are, and what the nuances are in terms of the challenges between building a fintech hub versus building a startup center. Let me just move the slide forward. There we go. So that's today's panelists, and we'll be meeting them very shortly. Please ask questions throughout the session. Some of the kind of key areas we want to talk about are there on your screen. Most important, it's really to get your involvement wherever we can, and so please use this as your opportunity to ask our really great speakers today some of the questions that you'd like to know and some of that are pertinent to your region or hub. And we know that we've joined by quite a broad range of attendees from today's session, so we're delighted to welcome attendees from across Southeast Asia, but also Europe and the Americas. So yes, please make use of the speakers that we've got on today. Just a couple of final slides from me then before we jump into the conversation. Looking at your screen there, you can see that there's a broad range of Asian markets, countries that are in the world's top 30 startup countries. And what we're going to talk about, obviously, is the fintech side of things. And on the next screen there, you can see what the fintech ranking looks like for different markets. And if you look at the sort of second column from the right, you can see the rankings that we published at the end of last year. So Asia is represented across the board when it comes to the top fintech hubs, and in terms of the scoring, Singapore in the ranking that we launched in December came out top at number 4, so right at the top. And Sydney, Tokyo, Auckland, also well within the upper reaches of fintech hubs worldwide. I think one of the elements that we want to talk about today is really, this combination, this contrast between what is a startup nation, but also how does being a fintech hub compare? Because if you look at this screen, you can see that there's quite a big difference in the scores for different cities. So, as Singapore, for example, it came very close. It scores very highly when it comes to its development as FinTech centre, and quite a lot higher than its position as a FinTech hub. Than its position as a startup centre, and I think that's really something that to me seems very interesting. And I think with the speakers that we've got today, it's going to be an interesting conversation. So that's enough from me. But so let's now jump into the conversation. I'd like to ask the panelists, if you just sort of looking at those numbers that are on the screen, the first column versus the second column, there are clearly sort of differences in how different cities compare when it comes to their position as a startup centre versus their position as a FinTech hub. I'd like to go, around the room, as it were. Perhaps, James, could we start with you? What for you are the essential ingredients to building a thriving FinTech hub? And do you agree with what the scoring seems to be saying, which is that FinTech hubs do differ quite markedly from a more general startup ecosystem position?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. The numbers are interesting, I have to say. But certainly, if I look at New Zealand historically, we are a nation of startup/stroke SMEs across a broad spectrum of sectors. FinTech, really, as most of us are aware, is still quite a new but emerging concept. If you go back sort of 4 or 5 years ago in certain jurisdictions, FinTech wasn't even really a thing. So when I look at the ranking for us in terms of startup, although it's still quite different to a number of other jurisdictions, it doesn't surprise me that we score better in that area, because if you look at some of the statistics coming out of the likes of Xero, 94% of the businesses and the companies actually in New Zealand fall into what we would consider to be that SME space. However, with the involvement of more collaboration and what you're talking about in terms of a hub nature, then we are starting to see more work being done very specifically in certain sectors. And clearly here in New Zealand, FinTech is definitely one of them at the top of the discussion points.
Thank you very much, James. Norbert, what's your take on both the differences, but also what for you in Japan are the ingredients to being sort of successful, positioning Japan as a centre for FinTech startup activity, but also for driving innovation in financial services.
Right. Thanks, Simon. I take two different looks at the data here, basically. One is the relative positioning within Asia, right? And I think most people would agree that Singapore and Hong Kong are ahead of Tokyo in terms of the development of FinTech hubs. I think many people would also say that China, in particular in the coastal regions, is quite advanced when you look at payments, for example. Maybe that doesn't apply to the country as a whole just yet, but lots going on there, of course. And so I think the relative positioning makes a lot of sense. If anything, I'm a bit surprised that Tokyo still ranks so high in the FinTech domain. Japan traditionally feels stronger, right, in manufacturing, innovation, engineering that happens there. I think we see lots of developments in IoT, in healthcare, etc. And the services sector is historically very inefficient. And before we actually get into the FinTech development and innovation there, I think we still have to catch up in terms of digitalization. There's just too much paper still, and if you're not digitized, then FinTech just becomes more difficult. And I think -3 relative on the FinTech rating, gut feel would have been a bit lower even. So but happy with that.
that people will be able to please. But yes, it's a marginal change, isn't it? So I think I think it's an interesting one. Rebecca, what would you agree with what's being said there? And what tell us a little bit about FinTech in Australia and how it's developing. What are your thoughts there?
Well, FinTech in Australia is quite progressive. We've obviously now got our third unicorn, so as a small little country, we're batting above our average. On the data that's presented there, I don't know if I necessarily agree. 3 out of 4 of our unicorns are based in Melbourne, and I think something like 8 out of our 10 biggest fintechs are based there. In addition, Stripe, Square, Revolut have all cardless, have all housed their stuff in Melbourne. But I think what is important about this and why Australia is such a good fintech hub is, one, we've got 4 big institutional banks that make it very similar to the UK market. So it makes it a perfect landing pad for fintechs to expand into APAC, test your product in a small ecosystem which has good adoption rates.
Yeah.
We're still number 19 according to EY's FinTech Adoption Index. So I think we're a perfect landing pad in the APAC market given our banking structure, and having 2 banks based in Melbourne and 2 banks based in Sydney, it makes them pretty convenient, and they're only an hour apart. So it's quite easy to get between the 2. So as a country, it's a pretty good country to launch a fintech.
Very good, thank you. Just a word that the vote is live, so the votes are. A couple of you have voted already, so please click on the audience vote on the right of your screen and take part in that question, and we'll bring that up a bit later on in the session. I wonder, if we could then look at mapping success. How useful is it to kind of benchmark your ecosystem with others, and on the assumption that there is some value and some use in that? What better data is needed to understand how individually your particular market or region even is how successful it is at being and developing new companies and driving innovation in financial services. Perhaps we can go to Japan first. Norbert, what's needed to understand how financial services is developing? What kind of data should we do we need to get to sort of be able to gauge and measure success?
Yeah, look at the initial votes coming in, so it's interesting to see that support from government and regulators is featuring very strongly right now. And I think that Japan, the regulator, has made a very strong turnaround when it came out with crypto regulation in 2017. I spent most of my career in capital markets, and I've been probably through 3 or 4 inspections by the Financial Services Agency, and that feels a bit like a wisdom tooth extraction typically, so it's not the most pleasant experience. And then actually seeing the regulators coming out and actually taking some risk in trying to set a regulatory framework very, very early was quite amazing, because you wouldn't have thought that something like this could happen even 5 years ago. So obviously it's still the 3rd largest economy in the world. So it's not necessarily competing for kind of the launching pad kind of title, although 20 years of steady prices or even deflation certainly has led to the cost of living index becoming quite affordable in Japan. And so I came here 23 years ago, and the prices today are pretty much the same if you compare this to New York, Silicon Valley, London, even Singapore and Hong Kong, I think living is relatively affordable. The people are highly skilled, well educated. The salaries are comparatively low, and so it actually, from that perspective, has many ingredients that it could make it successful. I'll leave some of the other aspects to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. Rebecca, let's go to you. What's it going to take to be able to measure how you're developing and how sort of successful you're being relative to other markets, and how valuable, is that valuable? Is that something that would be a useful kind of metric or measure?
I think benchmarking is always important, but I think what is more important is looking to other markets and seeing what they're doing well and seeing how you can replicate that. So in Australia at the moment, we're going through a Senate inquiry into FinTech and RegTech. And so particularly in relation to capital investment, regulatory sandboxes and data, within FinTech Australia particularly, on our recommendations, has looked to other markets and where we think they're doing a very good job on those aspects and presenting that back. I think benchmarking is important to encourage government and regulators to put in an increased effort into a sector. But I think what is more important is actually looking to other markets and what we can learn from them.
Very nice. Yeah, I agree with that. James, anything to add on that front?
Yeah, not an awful lot. I mean, I think both Rebecca and Norbert have said most of it, but I definitely agree. Having the data and understanding the sort of the data points then allows you to ascertain where you actually sit against your peers, taking into consideration obviously size of market and also actually the age of the market. So if you look at some of the statistics coming out there, and the current slide is Singapore sitting at the top. If you go back 4.5 years ago, FinTech in Singapore was very new, but they've done a great job in doing what your poll is suggesting. It's not necessarily just support. It's the ability to actually have the government, the regulators, and industry at the table having a single conversation. And that was something that we did last year. So never in the history of New Zealand has all of the regulators ever been sat in a single room with a single theme, and the theme was, what does the future of financial services in New Zealand actually look like? Because we understand fintech and blockchain and AI and all this new technology. But what we have to bear in mind that some governments are actually still on the journey. Some parts of government aren't even on the journey. So there's an education piece to allow them to understand the possibilities of engaging with, looking into and understanding what it might actually do for society, economic growth, and you can start to talk about digital and financial inclusion in a lot of different other things. But it's definitely it's something that we're promoting. And this year we will have 4 quarterly meetings with the ministers and all the regulators to continue to sort of build on the opportunities, because New Zealand many, many years ago was geographically challenged. And actually was the first country in the world to actually develop the refrigerated ship launched out of Dunedin in the South Island. But now we're actually in a position where we're a globally connected community. Therefore, that doesn't actually become a barrier for us. So we've been doing work for all of the government agencies, and most recently, actually, we did one for the Treasury, and it was exactly to Rebecca and Norbert's point. We reviewed all of what we call, or what we perceive to be, the thriving fintech hubs in the world, and we paired ourselves off against. And that was a really nice thing to do, because what it's allowed us to have the conversation with government is that here's where we are right now, here are some concerns, but ultimately, I suppose, here are some opportunities for us, because let's be honest, we do rely and have done for many a year on agriculture and tourism to prop up our economy. Whereas now what we're looking at is something that's very scalable, very low entry to barrier, And if you've got government regulation and industry support, then you can actually make it happen.
Yeah, well, so absolutely. Well, again, please do keep the votes coming in because they are useful, and as you can see, we on the panel are responding to those and reacting to them. So please keep them coming in. Rebecca, you very generously, brought us very kind of well into our next element of this conversation, which is around models and where does one look for inspiration and why. Perhaps we could kick it off with you. For Sydney, for Australia in general, rather, what is it that what kind of inspiration are you looking for? And can you name some names when it comes to other fintech hubs around the world that you think, offer some sort of indicator as to what direction you might take in the future?
Absolutely, but as a tragic Melburnian, we have to refer to Australia more broadly, not just Sydney. First of all, like looking at Singapore and some of the things they're doing in relation to super funds and investing in tech and startups, looking at Singapore and looking at how being a data body rather than multiple regulators looking after data as we have in Australia. We think the UK does a very good job in relation to investment and early stage investment and getting VC capital into the market. We're also looking at London and obviously the UK, and this will lead into something I know James wants to talk about, but for us, the consumer data right, which is our version of open banking, is kicking off at the moment and it's just passed Parliament. So London and the UK with their open banking regime is something we've looked at and the successes and the failures. So, for example, consumer adoption, how it's been rolled out, the right access, all these kinds of things are things that we looked at. And another key theme that we looked at overseas, and I think Singapore and the UK have both increased their investment, and New Zealand, is R&D tax. So I think for us, they're out some of our key things. I think some of those markets are doing a very good job with them.
Thank you. Excellent. Norbert, I mean, by your own admission, you said that fintech in Tokyo and also the service sector, at large, I think you said, is at a sort of an earlier, more formative phase, and that bureaucracy and red tape makes that a problem. Given where you're at with fintech in Japan, therefore. What are some of the things you'd like to do? And again, what models are you looking to? Are you kind of broadly in line with what Rebecca was just talking about there?
Absolutely in line. I think we're all great fans of Singapore. Right? I think it makes a difference if you run the country as a business, basically. And there's not many examples of that around the world. So that's a very commercial approach. And compared to London, we're in the same lucky position to have only one regulator, which I think is a great advantage, especially if you look at kind of the different responsibilities in the US and regulators basically fighting over different aspects of this emerging economy. So I don't want to repeat all of that, so I'll take a bit of an edge view here and say that basically there's two models, right, of developing an ecosystem. One is the developed country model where you have already structures in place and which might make it more difficult to do innovative things because there's always an aspect of protecting the incumbents maybe. And there's kind of the developing country world where these infrastructures don't exist yet. And from a Japan perspective, Cambodia is super interesting. They just rolled out a central bank digital currency. It's a system built by Soromitsu. That's a Japanese company. It's part of the Hyperledger Consortium. And it also helps financial inclusion because everybody who goes onto the payment app immediately gets an account opened with one of the banks. So while it's sponsored by the National Bank of Cambodia, it actually drives the whole financial services ecosystem forward. And I think much of the innovation in the fintech space might actually come out of kind of these countries rather than the much developed ones.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Norbert. Please do keep your questions coming in. We haven't had any from you yet, so use the opportunity, use the bar on the right-hand side to pose questions whenever you want. Now's your opportunity. James, let's turn to you. I mean, we don't necessarily need to cover the same ground in terms of the models, but I mean, do feel free to comment on that. I mean, clearly, you're an admirer of open banking, or at least the kind of regulatory sort of dimension in terms of inspiration is important to you. Again, what are the plans for FinTech New Zealand in terms of making that kind of regulatory alignment stronger and better?
Yeah, I mean, I won't go over what both Rebecca and Norbert have said. I mean, people are generally going to pick out Singapore and the UK, possibly New York now being the sort of number one, overtaking Silicon Valley most recently. I also quite like actually what Hong Kong are doing. Arguably, you could say that they're a little bit behind the eight ball with their counterpart in Singapore, but they've got a very clear focus now actually of what they actually want to do going into the future. Large amounts of investment in Cyberport and Greater Bay Area, which is going to be, I think, really good for them now that all the troubles died down. But in terms of what I suppose we're looking at, everybody's obviously sat and viewed the UK, having gone through the regulatory framework into the open banking model, and you only have to visit the UK to understand it's really not working as effectively as most people would like you to believe. Australia, obviously, Rebecca, will go live a little bit later in the year. Where we sit is an interesting one because historically New Zealand government would actually look to the UK, then they'd look to Australia, then they'd make a decision, and generally they'd just follow suit. So, I've been sitting down with the PM and the ministers to basically say I think that we're a much smaller market, therefore actually we could probably do things a little bit more agile. And I think that for us, at least, we want industry-led with government support. And I think that where we are right now, that's the theme that we're going at. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got from the minister at that regulation lunch is that that's the piece of work that they want us to continue on. So we set up a sort of a working group, for want of a better phrase, called Open Ecosystem, because we felt open banking, it's just too narrow. Yes, it might be a good test case, but the simple fact is that we've got to move to a point where actually it's data sharing across multiple parts of everyone or the consumer's life. And how do you build in the usual suspects, liability, privacy, all in the layers within that. So that's where we're taking it. We're probably progressing quicker than what we had anticipated. And certainly, I think that by the sort of middle part of this year, we've got something to sort of go out to the market with. Interestingly enough, from our point of view, back to Rebecca's point, it's not the fintech, it's not the regulator, it's not even government pushing this. It's actually the banks, which is a slight change from the UK. The banks are actually dragging their feet, and even some of them are still considering how do they actually look for exemptions or delays. Whereas actually we've got 6 of the top, between the top tier 1 and tier 2 banks, 6 of them here in New Zealand that have actually physically invested into actually moving this forward. So we're actually quite excited that we're actually taking a slightly different tact in the hope that obviously we'll have a good outcome.
Thank you very much. Let's just move a little bit. James, you mentioned zero, right at the beginning of the conversation, and I wonder, if you look again, this sort of connection or this perhaps disconnection between a startup centre and a fintech hub. How important to you is, a kind of a national, a champion, a unicorn, a large-scale fintech success or other startup success? How important is that to kind of, getting, not just regulation, but also, investors and other entrepreneurs that sort of coalesce and drive the ecosystem forward?
It's a great point, and I think it is very important, especially because we're a very small market. Rebecca mentioned at the start there, you've got 3 unicorns. I mean, we don't tend to talk about unicorns in New Zealand, I must admit, anymore, because the simple fact is that we're not going to, in theory, we're probably not going to produce a multiple portfolio of them. But having the likes of Zero, where they've been able to actually take a small product onto a global stage and perform very effectively. And they're not the only one. I mean, that's the other thing that we've got to bear in mind. We've got a number of very, highly successful organisations that have been able to take their products to the global stage. But as Rod Drury was back in the day at the helm, he was very good at spearheading and sharing the opportunities within New Zealand. And that's, I think, what we need to do more effectively across a broader spectrum of organisations. We've done it as a country very well. If we look at our agriculture, ag-tech sector, you only have to look into what they are doing in the US right now. And I mean, and they are doing some phenomenally good stuff. The UK government's also got behind them through the sort of the post-Brexit discussions, bearing in mind what's going on with the Welsh farming community as well. So I think it's about how you position it, but also how you use some of the other pieces of the jigsaw. So New Zealand, we're very fortunate. We still are the number one ease of doing business in the world. We're still joint second on the Corruption Perception Index. We've been lucky, we had the Royal Commission in Australia, which obviously uncovered some things. We had the RBNZ and the FMA, which is our local regulator here, do an investigation into the financial services, and they've also uncovered some things that they would like to see amended, but it was more around process rather than wrongdoing. So for me, it's about the positioning piece and how we share the story that then allows people to think, actually, maybe New Zealand's an area of interest. And certainly when we were back in the UK in September, wealthy individuals and wealthy families post-Brexit are looking for other markets that they haven't tapped into yet to explore, to diversify their portfolio. So that becomes quite exciting.
Okay, thank you very much for that, James. Norbert, let's turn to you. I mean, Japan, in terms of the three panelists, is a bit of an outlier here. I mean, it's an enormous economy and it has a lot of national champions in pretty much every sector one can think of. For the fintech marketplace in Japan, how important is a sort of startup success going to be in terms of helping energize, galvanize the fintech ecosystem to kind of create new products? Or is it really just much more about, getting the regulations right and making, lowering some of the barriers to entry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting that many of the national champions that you described have, and I would say quite successful innovation hubs and innovation centers, but very often they're not necessarily in Japan. They are in Singapore and in Israel and in the West Coast in the United States, for example. And so the innovation happens outside the country, and it also allows you to fail kind of outside the country, which is just the nature of doing a startup, and then try and import it back. But that's not to say that Japan isn't innovative. I think quite to the contrary. And two good examples are the QR code, right, that was invented in the Toyota supply chain in 1994. Unfortunately, they never really monetized this, and we import it back from China now for payment. And actually, on Japanese mobile phones in 2006, you were able to execute payments. So you could use your mobile phone and go to the subway and pay with the technology. And it was 1 year before the iPhone came out. And obviously, the first version of the iPhone wasn't what it is today. And so I think the challenge for many of these technology innovations and inventions from a Japanese perspective is more to make it successful outside of Japan. And when you look at many of the startup pitches that entrepreneurs here make, then they often already have an exit plan when they do the first fundraising. And they're like, this is how we're going to exit it. Well, like in America, you would say, here's how in 3 years we become a world-beating company. Right? And it's a fundamentally different approach, and shaking this up a bit and maybe making it more ambitious and crazily ambitious from a Japanese perspective to actually succeed outside of the country and build really a unicorn that's a global unicorn. That will be a turning point.
Yes. Okay. Well, we hope for that, of course. Rebecca, what's your take on this? I mean, is getting a kind of startup champion or a series of unicorns, is that what's really helping to kind of energize the marketplace? Do you see that kind of continued expansion in Australia because of the success you've had so far?
I don't think getting more unicorns will make the market more successful. I think what's really going to drive market success in Australia is consumer awareness. So making sure consumers are aware of the products in market, whether that is the buy now, pay laters, which some are unicorns, whether that is ability to transfer money overseas with lower FX pricing, or its ability to switch banks thanks to open banking. I think general consumer awareness will drive growth of Australian fintech. In addition, I think Australian fintech seeing the export capability and the options in overseas markets will drive growth. We're only big enough. Australia's market's not big enough unless they, for most instances, expand overseas. So we're going to continue to need to see overseas companies receive unicorn status to motivate Australian companies.
Great, thank you very much. Well, that does bring us sort of nicely to round nicely to the kind of final dimension of this conversation before we close for today, which is that kind of the international dimension here. I mean, how important, how valuable is it for much greater connectivity, collaboration, and sort of knowledge sharing between different fintech hubs? Rebecca, do you want to sort of start on that? And what do you see as the opportunity?
I think the biggest opportunity in this market is helping. We all run member organisations, and I think there's two ways this is really important. One way is to help our members grow. Connecting them into the right hub or the right regulator overseas is very important for their growth. And then another reason it's very important is that learning aspect. So when you have conversations with other regions and other markets, you often get a few takeaways you can bring back and implement in your own market. So I think the reason that the collaboration is important is ultimately how does it benefit our members and how does it help them grow or get more customers.
Fine. Thank you very much. Norbert, and then James, perhaps do you want to add anything to what Rebecca's saying there?
Yes, I think Rebecca used the term replicate earlier in the conversation. That's kind of how we refer to it, right? Ideas travel so tremendously fast in these times that you can't, if you just wait to kind of attack other markets, then somebody else will just have copied your idea. And we call them replicants. And like it happened with Uber in Southeast Asia, so where Grab came in and Gojek and in China as well. So I think we need the connectivity, and that can take two forms. It can really take the copying and kind of replicating the business model, or it can ideally, and that's where we like the collaborations that we have also with FinTech Australia and FinTech New Zealand. There was a question out there, are we open to more? We absolutely would love to build out our international community links as well, because we have helped companies that come here get exposure to the market, connect with the right lawyers, regulators, etc. And I think the more we can do this in a bi-directional or multi-directional fashion, the stronger the whole ecosystem is globally, and that's ultimately what we're all aiming for.
Thank you very much, Norbert. James, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would also add, I mean, if you look at what the FCA in the UK did last year when they launched the Global Financial Innovation Network, which was sort of the first attempt to have a global sandbox. I think we've still only got maybe 14 or 15 regulatory bodies around the world signed up to that. So that gives us an indication that there's potentially more work to be done. But I think to Norbert and Rebecca's point, The simple fact is that these fintech companies are thinking global day one. How do I launch into multiple markets simultaneously, as opposed to, back in the day, at least from a New Zealand perspective, it would have been Australia, possibly go left towards the US, or possibly go right towards Asia. And now it's how do I land in 15 different jurisdictions literally at the same time? And you only do that if you've actually got collaboration. You only do that if you've got understanding of the local markets. And that's where you build that by, working with other bodies, like from our point of view, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, MFAT, Department of International Trade. Rebecca works very closely with them as well. And we've picked about 5 or 6 that we've built really strong relationships with based on the feedback from our membership. And generally, actually, some, not all, are actually moving a little bit away from the US because it's a big market. There's a lot of opportunity up there, but it's also a very difficult market, and a lot of law, state or federal. It's not like breaking one country where you land in the UK. It's quite easy to break into parts of Europe, especially with what's going on in places like Paris and Germany, and the same in Asia. You land or host yourself in Singapore or Hong Kong, they're not fighting against each other because they know at some point you're going to enter into their marketplace. So I think it's, keeping the conversation going, understanding what our role is, and it's about being that sort of conduit for small and large organizations who want to gain market insights into new international territories and understanding the players in the market that they might want to partner with to remove that friction from some of the old legacy systems that these big incumbents actually tend to use.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that, James. So we're just going to wrap this up now. I mean, the votes from the poll show that the support from government regulators is definitely the priority when it comes to building a kind of busy, vibrant fintech marketplace. And if perhaps we could just go around the room again, sort of a final view on what are the kind of the plan, the outlook, individually for your own hubs, in the coming year. And the outlook for the next couple of years. Rebecca, do you want to start?
I think in the Australian market, we're looking forward to the rollout of CDR, and the final report of the Senate inquiry, which is due to be released in October. And from that, over the next few years, we'd like to see an increased R&D program to allow more fintech startups to get access. We would like to see an increased capital injection for early stage fintech to help them grow. We'd also like to see a shared KYC function, and we'd like to see the NPT roadmap fully rolled out in the next few years. So I think that's what we're looking forward to.
A busy time ahead. Norbert, how about you in Japan?
Well, we have the Olympics here coming in this summer, and so the country is trying very vigorously to make progress in cashless payment. And so until the end of June, there are actually rebates available by many retailers. If you pay in a cashless fashion, you actually get a credit on your statement at the end of the month. And there's lots of promotion around this. So hopefully the next time we'll do a global cashless payment survey, Japan won't be the laggard anymore. I think that will be a change, and it's been a 9-month promotion period, so it should hopefully be enough to be sustainable even when these incentives go away. We will get security token regulation in April, so everybody is looking forward to that. Timing seems a bit delayed, so we expect it to come out in April, and it will take a few months until everybody has digested it. But that goes and leads us down the path of really digitalizing any type of asset, and there's lots going on in the real estate space here preparing for that. And on the open banking side, we do have regulation that is on par with what's happening in the UK and in Europe. The implementation has been lagging it because the regulator didn't want to get prescriptive in terms of the commercial arrangements. And now the banks and the fintechs are fighting over who's actually going to pay for developing the APIs. While in Europe, I believe you have in the law that you can make five API calls per day per account or so. And so once we resolve this, I think it will just cause the banking system to become very open. More competition is always good, whether it's from fintech companies or other incumbents. And so there is the conglomerate called SBI, big fintech investor as well, but the towers on the head is planning to create the fourth mega bank in Japan alongside the existing three groups by rolling up regional banks. So it's a classic roll-up strategy. And I think this will be interesting to watch and see how this shakes up the market. It's the first time that you actually get a credible and capable new entrant at scale, and that might just shake things up a bit and create new competition, which would be helpful.
Fantastic. Very good. Well, we wish you lots of success with the Olympics, of course, which, back from London in 2012, it certainly, I can remember at the time that it certainly did a lot to kind of drive awareness of things like contactless, which, still then was sort of relatively new and not, were not widely adopted or accepted. James, what about you? Way over in Auckland, what things are you hoping for in this new decade? And where do you see New Zealand going in terms of its sort of fintech journey?
Yeah, for us, it's an exciting time because we're actually in an election year. So it gives us a great opportunity to actually have further and deeper engagement with both, obviously, the sitting government and obviously the opposition. So we're in the process of putting a paper together, really to make some strong recommendations, actually, in where we see the future actually going. One of the challenges that we have generally in New Zealand is this terminology that we lack some funding. And to a certain extent, that is actually true. A lot of our sort of fast growth companies end up going offshore to look for funding, and that can be from a variety of sources. But when you consider that across what we'd call our three super funds, there's about, I think, $220 billion sitting in that. We only invest 9% of it here in New Zealand. So the challenge I've given to the finance minister is, give me 1%, change it to 10%, and I'll make the tech sector thrive in New Zealand. So that's something that we'll be pushing for policy change to see whether that's actually possible. I think the other thing for me is really to progress the conversation around open banking, and we'll maintain that impetus really by getting all the regulators, industry, and government in the room to actually really understand what a solid framework looks like from the involvement of open banking into open data. In terms of alternative investments, we're working quite hard actually with a global company around intangible assets, and we've been speaking to the banks about lending against intangible assets and moving away from their old cash flow asset based. Because the simple fact is we now live in a digital age, therefore we really should be thinking about digital lending. And also then that leads me into digital literacy. So we've got to make sure that when we do evolve and create these new products and solutions and alternative methods of payment, to Norbert's point, we have to make sure we don't exclude anybody. New Zealand is a small country, but it's quite remote in areas. So we just have to be mindful that everybody comes on that. And we look at financial inclusion in companies' terminology to see whether that is actually something that they consider. And if it's not, then we obviously try and encourage that. We've got FATF down here doing an audit at the moment. As already mentioned, I think around sort of the standardization of things like AML and KYC. It's just going to make everybody's life a lot easier. So we've put a recommendation in to them to actually look at how easier or difficult that may actually be. Because the simple fact is, it's just a question of actually getting all the parties to agree what the methodology is, and then we roll it out. Very similar to what Royal Bank of Scotland did back in the UK when Ross McEwen, who's a Kiwi, had the idea that he wanted standardisation of interaction between small fintechs and large incumbents, because as most people generally know, it's difficult as a small organisation. You're burning capital waiting on a response from a big bank, and it's not always their fault, I must admit. It's just the due process that they have to go through. But the simple fact is, he took it upon himself to lead a piece of work, went to the British Standards Institute, got them to sign off on it, and then literally went to his 9 other peers and got them actually to accept it from a sector-wide perspective. So we've given it to one of the big banks here and said that I think you should lead that, which I think will be a really, really good outcome for us. And we'll just continue to build on some of that stuff that we've done before. We've supported Transparency New Zealand and a piece of work that they've done, which is the production of the Financial Integrity Systems Assessment, which is also endorsed by the RBNZ and the FMA, our local regulator. And that basically gives the industry another piece of a toolkit in their armoury to self-assess how well the industry is actually moving towards more transparency, because certainly in some of the instances we've seen in the last number of years across the globe, we definitely need some of that as well. So, and then we'll continue to do exactly what we've done and what others do is, go out, get into other markets, roll the sleeves up, get to meet people, understand the pros and the cons, and then be able to bring that information back to the members that are looking to expand into different jurisdictions. So quite a lot on the plate.
Yes, indeed. Well, it's a busy time, clearly, for all of us. Thank you to our panelists today. Thank you to James, to Norbert, and to Rebecca, of course. I hope it's been useful. I mean, James in particular, you mentioned, standardisation and sort of encouraging standards. And I hope, these kinds of forums, where we're talking to different hubs from around the world to help us drive connectivity. And sort of start to sort of set the template for sort of, more and deeper sort of sharing of information and expertise, and a way to sort of overcome some of the challenges. So thank you to you, our audience today. Thank you to our panelists. The materials are available online. You can download the attachment from the slides that we presented earlier. And you can, catch up and watch this webinar, listen to this webinar again, which will stay hosted on the website. But that's all from us. Thank you again to our panelists, and come back, join us soon for our next regional webinar when we look at Europe in a couple of weeks. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.